It didn't happen under the lights of a final. There was no red card, no shattered trophy, no moment replayed in outrage across the world. It happened on an ordinary afternoon in November 2020, the kind of game that disappears from memory by the next week. When Eden Hazard arrived at Real Madrid in 2019, he was introduced not as a signing, but as a succession plan. The heir to the left flank, the player meant to restore unpredictability to glide past defenders the way he once did for Chelsea FC. But from the very beginning, something felt slightly off. Not dramatic, just delayed. A muscle setback here, a cautious return there. By the 2020-21 season, the numbers had already begun whispering a truth nobody wanted to say out loud. Just 896 minutes played, 7 separate injury spells, and a rhythm that never quite returned. The explosiveness was still visible, but measured, controlled, protected. Then came November 28th against Alavés. 28 minutes into what was supposed to be another careful comeback, Hazard slowed after a challenge. He looked down, tried, jogged, stopped. The substitution board rose in red, no anger, no protest, just a quiet walk toward the touchline, and a stadium that didn't gasp but sighed. It was later confirmed as another muscle injury. Routine, familiar. But that was the moment something invisible changed. Because when he stepped off that pitch, it wasn't just his body that was being protected anymore. It was the beginning of a trust that would never fully return. When Eden Hazard left Chelsea FC in 2019, he didn't depart as a prospect. He left as a certainty. 2 Premier League titles, European nights where he bent games to his will, a player who could drift past defenders without appearing to accelerate, who carried chaos in his boots and calm in his expression. At Stamford Bridge, he wasn't managed. He was unleashed. Durable, decisive, inevitable. So, when Real Madrid unveiled him to a packed Bernabeu, the message was unmistakable. This was succession. This was continuity. And when he inherited the number 7 shirt once worn by Cristiano Ronaldo, it wasn't just fabric, it was expectation stitched into symbolism. Madrid didn't believe they were buying talent, they believed they were restoring destiny. But destiny requires momentum, and momentum requires presence. Almost immediately, interruptions crept into the script. An ankle fracture in his first season, muscle setbacks that delayed rhythm, weeks turning into months. The brilliance would flicker, a glide here, a threaded pass there, but it never sustained. In 2019-20, the flashes were visible, but fragmented. By 2020-21, the pattern had hardened. 7 separate injury spells, just 896 minutes across all competitions. For a player meant to define an era, he was instead fighting for continuity. When the world expected dominance, Madrid saw interruptions. And the most unsettling part wasn't statistical. It was visual. The first touch still had silk, but the second carried caution. The dribble still existed, but it felt measured. He would slow rather than explode, release the ball earlier than before, protect rather than provoke. It was subtle enough to ignore, but persistent enough to notice. Coaches spoke of managing fitness, protecting his body, preserving him for bigger nights. Yet preservation slowly replaced freedom. The number 7 wasn't dictating matches, it was being monitored. There was no collapse, no headline declaring failure, just a quiet undercurrent of anxiety building beneath the surface of expectation. Every return from injury felt like a restart. Every restart felt shorter than the last. And somewhere between the ovation of his unveiling and the silence of another rehabilitation room, the question began to whisper through Madrid's corridors. What if this era was never truly going to begin? November 28th, 2020. Real Madrid visited Mendizorroza to face Alavés in what should have been a routine La Liga fixture. For Eden Hazard, it was another step toward reasserting himself, a chance to reclaim the rhythm that had eluded him for months. Fans had waited to see the Hazard of Chelsea, the Hazard who could turn a static game into a spectacle with a flick of the heel or a sudden acceleration. But football, as always, has a way of humbling even the brightest of rivals. 28 minutes in, after a relatively minor collision with an opponent, Hazard slowed. The grimace was faint but unmistakable. He tried to jog, he tried to shake it off. But the body that had carried him through countless nights of triumph in London had betrayed him again. The substitution board glowed red. Head down, eyes fixed on the turf, he left the pitch, and the silence that followed was louder than any cheer. This wasn't just a muscle tweak or a minor setback, it was a symbol, a quiet fracture in a narrative that had been meticulously constructed. Analysts and journalists noted the hesitation in his movements before the substitution, the almost imperceptible limp in his stride, the fleeting glance toward the bench that betrayed awareness of the inevitable. There were no dramatic gestures, no explosive confrontations, no screams of frustration. It was a walk, a simple, controlled exit that carried weight far beyond the seconds it consumed. The world saw a substitution. Madrid saw a crack that would never fully close. And in that subtle departure, the story began to pivot. This wasn't injury alone. This was the beginning of the end of trust. For Hazard, every muscle strain, every careful minute on the field, every tactical substitution had been a slow erosion. But this moment crystallized the narrative. The minutes he would later accumulate were no longer about influence. They were ceremonial, symbolic gestures of presence rather than power. Coaches began treating his appearances as controlled experiments rather than genuine opportunities to dictate the game. And the fans, even before the headlines hit, sensed it. When a star is managed, rather than unleashed, the body speaks first, and the mind begins to follow. Hazard's aura, once magnetic, unstoppable, central, began to flicker under the soft, relentless pressure of fragility. By the time he reached the touchline, the atmosphere had subtly shifted. It wasn't anger, it wasn't disappointment, it was recognition. A quiet acknowledgement that the player Madrid had invested in, the one expected to inherit the legacy of the number 7 shirt, was no longer fully in control of his narrative. And in that moment, the substitution became more than tactical. It became a narrative pivot. The story that had begun with triumph and expectation now had a fracture line running through it, invisible to the casual observer, but unmistakable to those paying attention. The world saw a player leave the pitch. Madrid saw a symbol of something deeper, trust beginning to fade. The weeks after the Alavés substitution weren't marked by headlines or dramatic failures. They were marked by absence. Eden Hazard would return to the pitch in short bursts, 15-20 minutes at a time, as though he were a cameo in a story he once commanded. By the end of the 2020-21 season, he had appeared in just 21 matches, totaling 896 minutes across all competitions. For a player brought in to inherit Madrid's left wing, to drive attacks, to bend matches at will, this was almost ceremonial. It wasn't just the minutes themselves, it was how they were used. Coaches substituted him early, pulled him back from full exertion, measured his sprints, dictated his touches. Every appearance became a carefully choreographed experiment, a moment to check fitness rather than a chance to impose influence. The Hazard who once dictated tempo and dictated attention had been reduced to fragments, glimpses of brilliance without the space or time to breathe. Even when he did take to the pitch, the body language told more than the statistics. Analysts noted subtle hesitations, a touch held too long, a cutback delayed, a sprint aborted mid-stride. Heat maps showed him confined to pockets rather than roaming expansively. Low sprint outputs betrayed a cautious approach, and his involvement in transitions rarely reached the level expected of someone of his caliber. Observers familiar with his Chelsea days could see it instantly. The instinctive explosiveness was there, but it was controlled, measured, constrained. Every movement spoke of a player aware that one misstep could cost another week, another month. And the more he adapted to this cautious rhythm, the more the team adapted around him, not with him at the center, but in spite of him. By mid-season, the narrative had become almost self-evident. You didn't need goals to understand what had changed. You could see it in movement, in hesitation, in the way defenders no longer respected him the way they did in London. When Hazard received the ball, there was a pause, a microsecond, where the collective eye of the stadium measured whether this would be the spark they remembered or the reminder of what was lost. The psychological weight of expectation was heavier than the pitch itself. Fans and teammates alike began to treat his appearances as blessings rather than opportunities, watching more for reassurance that he was physically okay than for the audacious moments that once defined him. And yet he continued to step onto the grass. Every cameo, every minute reinforced the tension. The gap between expectation and reality, the distance between a legacy he carried and the trust that remained. There was no dramatic fall, no single moment to anchor a headline. Just a slow erosion visible only to those paying attention. The ceremonial appearances, the cautious touches, the silent acknowledgement that this hazard, the hazard of Chelsea, the hazard of destiny, had been replaced in function, if not in name. By the time he left the pitch, the body had spoken before the statistics, the trust had dissipated before the goals, and the quiet realization settled in. The untouchable star was no longer untouchable. By the time Hazard returned from injury for what would be his intermittent appearances in 2020-21, Real Madrid had quietly shifted. The team no longer waited. Vinicius Jr., Rodrigo, and Marco Asensio were no longer peripheral threats. They were taking the initiative, carving space, dictating transitions. The tactical blueprint that had once assumed Hazard as a central engine now pivoted to protect the squad's rhythm, to ensure that moments of brilliance were distributed rather than concentrated. Every pass Hazard received seemed to have a safety net, not in confidence, but in caution. Minutes were calculated, sprints measured, touches limited. For the first time since his Chelsea days, he wasn't the game's heartbeat. He was a controlled variable. The substitution against Alavés had been a symbolic fracture, but it was the pattern afterward that confirmed the shift. Coaches no longer structured the team around him. They protected him. When he started, it was in measured doses, often against weaker opponents or for short spells that wouldn't jeopardize his fitness. Analysts observed that the team's attacking transitions rarely relied on Hazard's movement. The flow came from others. He became a presence rather than a force, a figure whose name still commanded respect, but whose minutes carried more caution than expectation. Where once his dribbles created panic, they now prompted assessment. Could he last long enough to impact the game? Fans and media began to sense what had been quietly building. Social feeds noted his low touches, the cautious glances at the bench, the measured runs. Commentators would say, almost apologetically, Hazard adds flair, but the team does not depend on him in transitions. The narrative began to shift in real time. The star wasn't gone, but his centrality had vanished. Chronic injuries, limited minutes, and the tactical realignment around younger, fitter wingers made trust a scarce commodity. The quiet realization crystallized. Hazard was no longer untouchable. He was optional. His presence was ceremonial. His absence barely altered the rhythm of Madrid's matches. And the inevitability of this reality was what stung the most. There was no dramatic headline to mark a fall, just the slow, inescapable understanding that the team had moved on. The substitution, the cautious minutes, the measured touches, they were all early signs, breadcrumbs for the attentive eye. By now, the question was not, can Hazard regain full influence? But did anyone expect him to? The silence surrounding his minutes was louder than any applause he had ever received. In that quiet, the story was clear. Madrid had adapted, evolved, and Hazard's role, once central, once symbolic of audacious brilliance, had become peripheral. And in this periphery, the stage was set for the final chapter of his Real Madrid story. By the time Hazard's Real Madrid chapter drew to a close, the story was no longer about goals, assists, or statistics. It was about presence and perception. Eden Hazard had arrived as a figure of destiny, expected to inherit the left wing and carry the weight of the number 7 shirt after Cristiano Ronaldo. But destiny, as it turned out, is fragile. The combination of recurrent injuries, cautious management, and tactical adjustments had created a subtle but irreversible shift. Trust left the pitch before he did. Fans no longer watched for the spark of audacious genius. They watched to see if he could simply last the minutes allotted to him. The superstar aura was intact in name, but its substance had faded, almost imperceptibly until the quiet became undeniable. Meanwhile, a new generation rose in Madrid. Vinicius Jr. surged down the flank with fearless abandon. Rodrigo and Asensio filled gaps with youthful energy, and the team's attacking rhythm no longer depended on Hazard's flicks or dribbles. Tactical flexibility replaced star reliance. Every game Hazard played became almost ceremonial, a nod to past expectation, a reminder of what might have been. The narrative was no longer about a fallen star, but about a system that had evolved around necessity. Analysts would later observe, Hazard's brilliance was never fully lost, it just became irrelevant to the team's present identity. The trust that had once been instantaneous now required justification, and the justification was never fully granted. The most striking aspect of his Real Madrid story wasn't measured in minutes or injuries, it was in body language. His hesitations, the cautious touches, the subtle glances toward the bench, even when fit, told a story before any statistics could. This was the essence of the quiet collapse. A player who once dictated games became a managed presence. His appearances controlled and limited, his influence no longer central. The substitution against Alavés, once a minor note in a league fixture, had crystallized the narrative. Trust fractured, minutes became ceremonial, and the perception, subtle, persistent, irreversible, reshaped his legacy. And yet, the story isn't one of failure in the conventional sense. It's about inevitability and the evolution of football at the highest level. Hazard's decline at Madrid was never dramatic. It was silent, measured, almost invisible until the pattern became undeniable. The substitution wasn't the end. The silence that followed, the absence of trust, the marginalization in the team's tactical heartbeat, that was the real marker. Eden Hazard didn't fall from grace with a scream or a headline. He faded quietly, leaving behind a lesson. In modern football, brilliance must be sustained by body, mind, and system alike. And when any of these falters, even the greatest names can become peripheral.